How do we become male or female? It seems like it's a fundamental question, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Almost. Simple.
Yeah, on the surface. But biologically,
Yeah.
oh, the journey is incredibly intricate, like really complex.
A true masterpiece of biological engineering, you could say. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Chapter 53, Sexual Differentiation, from Boron and Boulpaep's Medical Physiology.
Right. And our mission here really is to guide you through this dense chapter. We want to translate these complex concepts into clear, engaging explanations.
So you can build a solid mental picture.
Exactly. How bodies develop sexually, from the initial genetic blueprint all the way to the anatomy and function.
And you won't need a single diagram.
Nope. Just listen as we connect the dots. We really want to make this essential material stick, especially if you're a college or medical student trying to master this stuff.
It's this fascinating blend, really. Genetics, cell biology, endocrinology, all working together.
It's an orchestration.
Definitely. Get ready for some surprising facts and maybe more importantly, those crucial connections to real-world clinical scenarios. That's what really helps solidify understanding, I find.
Absolutely.
So let's begin with nature's grand strategy, perpetuating the species. It's not just survival, is it? It's also about diversity.
Precisely. And evolving two distinct sexes, male and female, has been, well, a profoundly successful approach for diversification.
This idea of sexual dimorphism.
Right, the anatomical and functional differences between sexes that help with procreation. Think about, say, frogs, oviparous species.
External fertilization.
Yeah, and the source points out that can be pretty wasteful. Lots of gametes just don't make it.
Compared to internal fertilization in mammals.
Much more efficient. Specific roles increase the chances, though, nature loves exceptions.
Like hermaphrodites.
Exactly. Minutia species like cestodes, some nematodes, they produce both gametes. But for most complex life, including us, it relies on this really intricate sexual differentiation.
And for humans, this whole journey kicks off with our genetic makeup. Those 22 pairs of autosomes.
The general body plan instructions.
Right, and then that single, absolutely pivotal pair of sex chromosomes. XX for females, XY for males.
Okay, so to really get how these chromosomes set the stage, we probably need a quick refresher on cell division. Two key types here.
Mitosis first.
Yeah, mitosis. That's for your somatic cells. Basically everything but the reproductive cells. It just makes identical copies.
What?
Two daughter cells, same 46 chromosomes.
Perfect clones for growth and repair, no mixing.
Exactly. No genetic exchange, just duplication.
Okay, so if mitosis is about copying, meiosis is about shuffling the deck.
That's a great way to put it. Meiosis happens only in germ cells, spermatogonia, and males, gobogonia, and females. It's the reduction division.
Cutting the chromosome number in half.
Right, from diploid 46 down to haploid 23. And it happens in two stages. Meiosis the first is where the magic happens for diversity.
Crossing over.
Precisely. Chromosomes duplicate, then homologous pairs swap genetic material. That's crossing over. Key source of recombination. Makes every gamete unique.
And then meiosis the second.
Meiosis the second is simpler. The sister chromatids just separate. You end up with unduplicated haploid chromosomes.
And you mentioned a difference in output.
Oh yeah, big difference. One spermatogonium, it yields 4 spermatids, but one ovogonium makes only one mature oocyte.
And the other things.
Just 2 polar bodies, which basically degenerate. Huge difference in strategy.
Okay, so meiosis makes these unique gametes. When do we actually get those genetic marching orders? The moment that sets the path.
That critical moment is fertilization, when a haploid sperm meets a haploid ovum.
Forming the diploid zygote. Back to 46 chromosomes.
Exactly. And here's the key point. The ovum always brings an X chromosome. Always.
But the sperm is different.
Right. The sperm is heterogametic. It carries either an X or a Y. So the sperm determines the genetic sex.
X sperm means XX zygote female?
Correct. And a Y sperm means an XY zygote, male. This establishes the genotypic sex. That's the blueprint guiding everything else.
So the Y chromosome is really the decider.
Fundamentally, yes. Its presence dictates male development. Its absence allows female development. It's quite remarkable.
Wow, okay, so that Y chromosome wields a lot of power right from the start. Once that genotypic sex is set, how does the body actually start building the gonads, the core reproductive organs?
Yeah, they don't just pop into existence. Around 5 weeks into development, in the early embryo, you get what's called an indifferent gonad.
Indifferent meaning. It could go either way.
Exactly. It has an outer layer, the cortex, and an inner part, the medulla. And this structure has the potential to become either an ovary or a testes. What's really interesting is that the germ cells themselves, the precursors to sperm and eggs, seem to play a role in guiding this.
A fork in the road. So what's the signal? What pushes it one way or the other?
For an XY embryo, it's that Y chromosome exerting its testis-determining effect, specifically one gene. Exactly. The SRY gene, sex-determining region Y. It's on the short arm of the Y. This is the master switch.
What does it switch on?
It codes for a transcription factor. This factor tells the medulla of that indifferent gonad, okay, time to become a testis. And meanwhile, the cortex just regresses.
And inside the developing testes.
Those primordial germ cells migrate into structures called primitive sex cords. These hollow out, become seminiferous tubules, and house the spermatogonia and Sertoli cells. You also get the rete testes forming, a network connecting to the efferent ductules.
Okay, that's the male path, driven by SRY. What about the XX embryo? No SRY gene there.
Right. So in the absence of SRY, the default path, you could say, is for the indifferent gonad's cortex to develop into an ovary.
And the medulla?
The medulla regresses. Those primordial germ cells stay in the cortex, which thickens. They get surrounded by other cells forming secondary sex cords, eventually becoming primary oocytes.
So development follows the cortex instead of the medulla.
Precisely. And it's important to note you need 2 intact X chromosomes for normal ovarian development to fully complete.
That single SRY gene really is the linchpin, which naturally leads to the question, what if something goes wrong with the chromosomes, or maybe that SRY gene isn't where it's supposed to be?
Right, and that's where we see conditions known as gonadal dysgenesis, meaning abnormal gonad development. A classic example is Turner syndrome.
That's 45XO, right, missing a sex chromosome.
Exactly. Individuals with Turner syndrome develop what are called streak gonads. They're basically fibrous streaks of connective tissue, not functional gonads.
And that affects the development.
Yes, typically leads to short stature, primary amenorrhea, meaning no menstruation, and sexual infantilism, even though the internal and external female structures are generally formed, just immature. Partial deletions of the X can cause issues too.
And can the genotype and the gonad type mismatch?
Absolutely. That's the discordance you mentioned. Take an XX male, genetically female but phenotypically male.
How does that happen?
Usually, the SRY gene actually gets moved, translocated from the father's Y chromosome onto an X chromosome during meiosis when sperm are made. So the XX zygote gets an SRY gene.
Wow. And the reverse, XY but appearing female.
That can happen too. If the Y chromosome is missing its SRY gene, or if something blocks its expression, that leads to pure gonadal dysgenesis. It just hammers home how dominant that SRY gene really is.
Okay, so the gonads are forming testes or ovary. But what about the internal plumbing? The ducts that carry the sperm or eggs? How does that get sorted out? Must be complicated.
It is. Early on, all embryos, regardless of XX or XY, have a double set of precursor ducts.
2 sets.
Yep. The mesonephric ducts, also called Wolffian ducts, and the paramesonephric ducts, or Müllerian ducts. They're initially linked to some temporary embryonic kidneys.
Müllerian. Sounds familiar.
Right, the Müllerian ducts actually fuse at their lower ends to form a uterovaginal primordium. Gives you a hint.
So 2 sets of pipes. What decides which set develops and which one disappears?
Hormones. Hormones from the newly forming gonad are absolutely critical here. The classic work was done by Alfred Jost back in the 50s with rabbits. Groundbreaking stuff.
What did he find? Let's start with males.
Okay, in males, the developing testes makes 2 key things. First, testosterone from the Leydig cells. Testosterone tells the Wolffian ducts keep growing.
So they become the epididymis, vas deferens.
Epididymis, vas deferens, seminal vesicles, ejaculatory duct, all depend on testosterone, but that's not all the testes does.
What was the second hormone?
Anti-Müllerian hormone, AMH, also called Müllerian inhibiting substance, MIS. This comes from the Sertoli cells.
And its job is?
Its job is to make the Müllerian ducts regress, disappear. This is crucial. Testosterone alone isn't enough for male internal development. You need AMH to get rid of the potential female structures.
Okay, so testosterone builds the male ducts, AMH removes the female ones. What about in females?
In females, it's largely about absence. No testes means no AMH.
So the Müllerian ducts just develop.
Exactly. They spontaneously develop into the fallopian tubes, the uterus fundus, corpus cervix, and the upper part of the vagina.
And the Wolffian ducts?
No testosterone, so they just spontaneously degenerate. What's really interesting is the ovary itself isn't needed for this. It's kind of the default pathway if those male hormones aren't present.
So the testis is actively driving male internal development, while female development happens passively without those signals.
Hmm.
What does this mean clinically? Understanding Jost's work.
Oh, it's fundamental for diagnosing disorders of sexual development, or DSDs.
Hmm.
For example, think about an XY fetus. They make testosterone, so Wolffian ducts develop.
Okay.
But what if they have a mutation and don't make AMH?
Then the Mullerian ducts wouldn't regress.
Exactly. They could end up having both male and female internal ducts, even with normal testosterone. Understanding these specific roles lets clinicians pinpoint where the problem lies: hormone production, hormone receptors, etc.
Fascinating. Okay, let's move externally. What we see on the outside. How do the external genitalia differentiate given they also start from common structures?
Another amazing transformation from shared beginnings. Both XX and XY embryos start with a genital tubercle, paired urogenital folds, and paired labioscrotal swellings.
3 basic parts.
Right. The genital tubercle grows into a phallus in both, but eventually becomes the glans, penis in males, and the clitoris in females.
Okay, penis or clitoris from the tubercle. What about the folds?
The urogenital folds become the underside, the ventral aspect of the penis shaft in males. In females, they remain separate and become the labia minora.
And the swellings.
The labioscrotal swellings fuse together in males to form the scrotum. In females, they mostly stay unfused and become the labia majora, fusing just at the front to form the mons pubis.
Incredible how the same starting parts create such different outcomes. What's the hormonal signal here? Is it still testosterone leading the charge?
This is a really crucial distinction. While testosterone is key for the internal male ducts, full masculinization of the urogenital sinus, which forms the bladder and urethra, and the external genitalia requires something else.
Not testosterone.
Not directly. It requires dihydrotestosterone, DHT.
DHT. Where does that come from?
Cells in those specific external tissues have an enzyme called 5-reductase. This enzyme converts testosterone into DHT, which is actually a more potent androgen in these tissues.
So testosterone is made, travels there, gets converted, and then DHT does the work.
Exactly. DHT drives the genital tubercle to fully elongate into the penis, and it causes the urogenital folds to fuse, including the penile urethra.
Okay, so if internal plumbing needs testosterone, the external shaping needs DHT. What happens clinically if there's a problem with DHT? Like that enzyme, 5-reductase.
That leads directly to the condition called 5-reductase deficiency. These individuals are genetically male, XY.
So they make testosterone.
Yes, and their internal Wolffian ducts develop normally because those respond to testosterone.
But externally?
Externally, virilization is impaired because they can't make enough DHT. This often results in ambiguous genitalia, or sometimes external genitalia that appear female. They might be raised female, then experience surprising masculinization at puberty when testosterone levels surge.
Wow. That highlights the different roles perfectly. What about other clinical connections here?
Another really important one is congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. This isn't a gonad problem, it's an adrenal gland issue.
The adrenals make androgens too, right?
They do. In CAH, usually due to a deficiency in the enzyme 21-hydroxylase, the adrenal gland can't make cortisol and aldosterone efficiently. So, the steroid precursors get shunted into making androgens instead. Lots of extra androgens.
What does that do to a developing female fetus, XX?
In a genetic female, this flood of androgens causes virilization. The clitoris can enlarge, sometimes resembling a penis. The labioscrotal folds might fuse, looking like a scrotum. The result is ambiguous genitalia at birth, purely due to the hormonal environment.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Clinically so important to recognize. Speaking of male development, what about testicular descent? That's another key step, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it's also androgen dependent. It usually finishes by the 7th month of gestation. It's a multi-stage process.
How does it work?
Well, first, the testes move relatively downwards towards the groin area as the abdomen grows. Then part of the abdominal wall pushes out, forming the inguinal canal that's the processus vaginalis.
Creating a tunnel.
Sort of, yeah. And finally, a ligament called the gubernaculum basically guides the testes down through that canal into the scrotum.
And if that fails?
That's called cryptorchidism, or undescended testes. It's another sign we might see if there's inadequate androgen production or action. Think about 5-reductase deficiency again, or conditions like complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, where the receptors don't work. Even if testosterone is there, if it can't signal properly or can't be converted to DHT where needed, the testes might not descend.
It really is all interconnected. Okay, we've covered genetics, gonads, internal ducts, external structures. Beyond these physical differences, do these early hormones also shape the brain? Is there like a male brain and female brain development?
That's a really active and complex area of research. The concept is sexual dimorphism in the brain. While it's super complex, especially in humans, studies in other mammals clearly show gonadal steroids influencing the development of specific brain areas or nuclei.
So androgens masculinize parts of the brain.
Interestingly, it's often not the androgens directly. There's an enzyme in the brain called aromatase.
Aromatase converts androgens to estrogens, right?
Exactly. So in many cases, androgens act as prohormones. They get converted into estrogens within specific brain cells. And it seems to be these locally produced estrogens that actually masculinize certain sexually dimorphic nuclei.
Estrogen masculinizes the brain. That seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it? But that seems to be the mechanism in many animal models. This brain differentiation might influence things like sexual behavior patterns later in life, and maybe even the pattern of gonadotropin release from the pituitary. It's typically cyclic in females and more constant or tonic in males.
So much complexity, even in the brain. Okay, so from conception through infancy, the stage is set, the major structures are laid down. What about the grand finale? When does sexual differentiation really complete?
That final chapter unfolds at puberty. Puberty is this period of massive hormonal change that finishes the job, maturing both the primary sex characteristics, the gonads and ducts, and developing the secondary sex characteristics.
Like what happens in females?
In females, rising estrogen causes the uterus and cervix to grow, become more secretory, and makes the vaginal lining proliferate. Progesterone joins in mainly for developing the breast alveoli, the milk-producing units, while estrogen drives the duct system growth in the breasts.
And in males?
In males, the surge in testosterone causes rapid growth of the penis and a really dramatic increase in the size of the testes, getting them ready for sperm production. It's the final step in becoming reproductively mature.
This whole deep dive just shows, wow, how incredibly orchestrated the human body is. From one cell to a fully differentiated adult, it's really quite amazing.
It truly is. And what strikes me is how something seemingly simple, male or female, is built on these incredibly complex layers of genetics, hormones, timing.
Critical timing windows.
Exactly. And different molecules doing different jobs in different tissues. It really drives home that physiology is rarely just a straight line. It's networked, layered, interconnected.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener? You've just navigated a really dense, but let's face it, incredibly important chapter with us. You've seen the chain reaction. Genetic sex sets gonadal sex.
Which then uses hormones, testosterone, DHT, AMH to direct the development of internal and external phenotypic sex.
And crucially, you've connected these fundamental processes to real-world clinical conditions like Turner syndrome, CAH, pyridoxine deficiency. That gives you a powerful framework, doesn't it, for understanding health and disease related to sexual development.
It really does. Remember, mastering physiology isn't just memorizing facts. It's about building that mental picture, connecting the dots, really understanding the why behind the what. And you've just done a fantastic job of tackling a tough topic.
Absolutely. And remember, you are part of the Deep Dive family, totally capable of mastering even the most complex material. Keep that curiosity fired up. Keep digging deeper.
Definitely. Until next time, here's something to think about.
As our understanding of genetics, and especially epigenetics, how gene expression is controlled, continues to advance, how might that change our view of sexual differentiation? Could it reveal even more layers to this intricate process, and maybe even offer new approaches to related health conditions?